So, again, we have in 1 Kings chapter 6 the construction of the temple. You've got two different parts, the holy and the most holy place, and that's what we're going to look at this morning. Now, some of the details about the temple itself that, at least in my mind, I often don't think about because, there's some parts of the temple that you remember. There's certain aspects in here that I was reading through that I kind of forgot that was in there, and we're going to kind of look at some of that this morning. So in verse 15, verse 14 says that Solomon built the house and finished it. And it said that he lined the walls of the house on the inside with boards of cedar, from the floor of the house to the walls of the ceiling. He covered them on the inside with wood, and he covered the floor of the house with boards of cypress. So one of the things that we notice about the temple is that part of the reason why Solomon imports a bunch of cedar trees is not just for maybe part of the frame of the building, but it's also to overlay the floors and the walls. Again, keep in mind that at this time, most houses, when it came to their floors, they were made out of what? Yeah, they're made out of dirt. This coat's getting a little bit warm, so I'm going to go ahead and take it off. Yeah, so when it came to houses, their floors typically are made of dirt. And as you can imagine, this is the temple of God. You don't really want it to get very dirty. And obviously, when you talk about the concept of ritual cleanliness, when it came to the priest, who obviously had to bathe, make sure that they were properly clean whenever they offered sacrifices or performed certain duties within the temple, it makes sense to make sure that the floors itself were not dirt, right? To help with cleanliness. And so that also helps explains why in verse 15 that part of the reason why the temple is going to require all this wood is also to help keep it clean. And that's, of course, because the floor is not going to be made of wood, but it's going to be overlaid, or it's not going to be made of dirt, but it's obviously going to be overlaid with wood, as were the walls. When you think about it today, a lot of people in their homes prefer to have wood, as part of their flooring, or some type of maybe substitute for wood, or to make it look like wood because it looks nice. Some people like carpet, but typically, today, perhaps in your house you have maybe parts of your house you have wooden flooring. People tend to like that. I know the church building here, before we renovated the auditorium, right, we had the wooden paneling. Was that actually made out of wood? Type of wood, yeah. I'm not all that familiar with that. Construction's not my thing, but yeah, you might remember, right? I know all of us in here do remember, but if we were here, that we had wood that kind of surrounded the outside of the. It was here in the auditorium, wooden paneling, and that was just throughout American history. That's kind of been sometimes that's been a popular trend. When you think about within the temple, this picture kind of gets at that. You can kind of tell some of this, and obviously we talk about it eventually, why the gold's important, but within the floor and within the walls of the temple, right, you have that wooden covering. Most buildings at that point are not going to have that because that costs a lot of money to put wood down in your floor. But of course, this is the temple of God, and obviously Solomon wants it to make it as nice as possible. And obviously, we get the two sections, at least within the temple. Obviously, you have an entrance here to the holy place, which, if you look here in the Bible, you've got what's called the inner sanctuary, the most holy place, and then the outer sanctuary, which is the holy place. So we'll talk more about that as we go in a minute, but this picture kind of here gives you an idea about the sense of maybe what it looked like with the woodwork within inside it. We'll talk more about that in a minute. In verse 16 it says that he built 20 cubits of the rear of the house with boards of cedar from the floors to the walls, and he built this within as an inner sanctuary as the most holy place. So yeah, essentially we get the dimensions from that. The most holy place is going to be the smaller of the two, only taking up about a third of the length of the structure that's being talked about here. The other 2/3 are taken up by the holy place. Now we know, of course, that within the most holy place, the high priest would go in there once a year. And at this point in time, the Ark of the Covenant, because this is when it's first being built, the Ark of the Covenant doesn't actually reside in the most holy place at this point. We're going to talk about that in a minute, or talk about that later on when the Ark is brought to the temple. But at this point in time, the Ark is not there, but we know that one of the pieces within the Ark, or pieces within the most holy place, is the Ark of the Covenant, which within that was held the rod of Aaron that bloomed, the manna that was obviously connected to the wandering in the wilderness, and then also the broken 10 Commandments. Of course, the Ark of the Covenant, as we've already seen, was to represent the presence of God. That's also, it helps explain why only the high priest was allowed to enter in once every year, which was called the Day of Atonement, which corresponds to, do y'all know what date that corresponds to today? Today, Judaism celebrates that day. You may see this on your calendar, but it's called Yom Kippur. If you ever see that date on your calendar, that's a reference to the Day of Atonement. Most calendars have that date, so if you see that, it's actually a reference to the Day of Atonement. Celebrated September the 24th through the 25th. Most of y'all in here might remember that Israel back in the 1970s fought a war with Egypt, and it was called the... Y'all remember what type of war that was called? Or the name of it? It's called Yom Kippur. Anyway, because it took place around the time of the Day of Atonement, which is why it was called that, which President Carter helped negotiate the peace treaty. And, you know, if you kept up with the news, President Carter's been put on hospice care because he's actually the oldest former living president. But anyway, if you see the date Yom Kippur, it's a reference to the Day of Atonement. Of course, we know that that's when the high priest would enter in to offer the sacrifices for the sins of the people. And that's what's being described here in verse 16. About 1/3 of that inner portion of Solomon's temple was made up of the most holy place. So verse 17, the house, that is the nave in front of the inner sanctuary, was 40 cubits long. So that would then be a reference to the holy place. Now, if you've got a different translation if you're using a different translation, what do you have there for the word nave in verse 17?
King James says temple.
I think the King James says the temple. Is there any other word that y'all have there? Temple, nave. I don't have the New King James with me. Temple sanctuary.
That's in the New King James.
So one of the things about that word is that it kind of corresponds to a certain extent with the structure of some of the larger Catholic cathedrals, which, if you study Catholicism does have some ties to the Old Testament in a way. When you think about priest and all that, the priesthood and all that, there are ties there. But in so the New King James has temple sanctuary. The ESV has the term nave. And if you're familiar, and this is one way that this connects to the present, if you're familiar with those terms, it's actually connected to, we'll come back to that in a minute. That shows the different portions, the holy place and the most holy place. If you're familiar with Catholicism, there's a portion within cathedrals that is often connected to there are portions of the Catholic cathedral that part of it's called the nave. Sometimes that's also referred to as the sanctuary. And this is particularly true in some of the larger cathedrals over in Europe, and in particular the older cathedrals, where they're often built in this same structure. And the concept of the nave is this is basically where, if you're a regular member or an ordinary person within the Catholic Church and you go and you celebrate Mass or some type of worship setting, you're going to be sitting right here in the nave, which is basically the understanding that this is where the common person is able to sit. So back here where you have the apse or the main altar, typically that's where the priest would sit, and typically do sit within the within the church building. So within Catholicism, there's a certain concept where there's a separation between a certain group of individuals, the priesthood, and then the laity or the regular church members. When I was down in, me and some friends went to New Orleans a few years ago, and there's a really big cathedral there named the St. Louis Cathedral. And it's kind of set up similar in a way. This is a picture taken of it, but you have the nave, which is where the common person sits. And then you have the apse, or the main, what they call main altar, that sits at the front. That's where the priests typically sit. This is probably a better example. I believe this is in France, of a cathedral. But you have the section of the nave, which is where the common person sits, and then what they're facing is going to be the area where the priest would sit. But it kind of builds off of, so like today, those cathedrals kind of build off of the way that the temple was laid out, in the sense of only one person, the high priest, could enter into the most holy place, but the other priests were resigned to what the ESV, or what the New King James has here is either the nave or the temple. So that's kind of one way that what we're reading about connects to the present. Anyway, I thought that might be an interesting little tidbit as we look through this. Now, one of the details that I don't think about when I think about the construction of the temple was the carvings within the temple. And that's verse 18. It says that the cedar within the house was carved in the form of gourds and open flowers. All was cedar, no stone was seen. If we look down in verse 29, it also says that around all the walls of the house, Solomon had people carved engraved figures of cherubim and palm trees and open flowers in the inner and the outer rooms. So if you go back and look at this picture, which sets it up again, you might notice that within both the most holy place and the holy place, that there are actual carvings inside the building. Now that's something that's a detail that for me that I don't typically think about when I think about the construction of the temple. I think about the amount of gold that's overlaid, but you also don't think about the level of artistry, of artwork that goes into making these engravings within the temple, which Solomon obviously approved of. And again, some of these images would have, of course, been very important to the people of Israel. Of course, you think about we'll see in a minute. We'll talk about cherubim in a minute, but that's kind of a detail that we don't often think about, right? All the level of artwork that went into the carving within the temple. So, and we may come back and talk about some of the specific objects as well if we have time to do that, about what their role was. So, verse 19, the inner sanctuary he prepared in the innermost part of the house to set there the ark of the covenant of the Lord, which eventually will be moved to the most holy place. Again, verse 20, the inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 20 cubits high, which is why it's basically a square. The most holy place, or the holy place, would simply be a rectangle. He overlaid it with pure gold. He also overlaid an altar of cedar. And Solomon overlaid the inside of the house with pure gold, and he drew chains of gold across in front of the inner sanctuary and overlaid it with gold. And he overlaid the whole house with gold until all the house was filled. Also the whole altar that belonged to the inner sanctuary he overlaid with gold. And of course, that's going to be a reference, and that's kind of what we see here, right? That everywhere that you looked within the holy place and the most holy place, you saw gold that was overlaying the wood that had been carved into it. Now, notice that there was verse 21, that there were chains of gold across in front of the inner sanctuary. Of course, we know later on with the construction of the second temple, you would also have the veil that's constructed there that becomes very important. As Jesus died on the cross, the veil is torn in half, which again represented God's presence leaving the temple, and obviously connected to the establishment of the church as well. When you think about some of the objects within the holy place, the altar of incense was very important, because when priests offered incense on that, the concept is that the smoke of the incense would then drift into the most holy place, which in the Bible, you read about God smelling that and smelling it as a sweet savor. Of course, we know in the book of Leviticus, Nadab and Abihu offer improper incense to God, and they're subsequently punished for that. You also had within the holy place the lampstand. You had the table of showbread. Notice, of course, we talked about yesterday the chambers that are built on the outside of the temple, right? And that's what we have there with the priest's room. Which again, those are storage places used for the to help out with the priest. And we know with the table of showbread, as we've already seen in the book of 1 Samuel, this was something that only the priest could eat of, but we know that David did eat of the table of showbread when he was on the run and was hungry. But typically, that's the table of showbread was partly reserved there for the priest. All right, so we get the concept of all the gold that's there. Verse 23, in the inner sanctuary, he made 2 cherubim of olive wood, each 10 cubits high. Now, this is another detail that for me personally, that I didn't think about with the construction of the temple. Because in my mind, when the high priest entered into the most holy place, all that was sitting there was the Ark of the Covenant with the mercy seat sitting on top of the Ark of the Covenant. There are actually 2 cherubim, which, if you read through the Bible, you read about different descriptions of the Bible, or different descriptions of what a cherubim was. Obviously we connect this to an angel, but exactly what did a cherubim look like? We don't have necessarily we've had artists come up with it, with different depictions of it, but again, it's very hard to describe. But notice that there were 2 cherubim that sat each 10 cubits high. 5 cubits was the length of one wing of the cherub, and 5 cubits the length of the other wing of the cherub. It was 10 cubits from the tip of one wing to the tip of the other. The other cherub also measured 10 cubits. Both cherubim had the same measure and the same form. The height of one cherub was 10 cubits, and so was that of the other cherub. He put the cherubim in the innermost part of the house, and the wings of the cherubim were spread out so that a wing of one touched the one wall, and a wing of the other cherub touched the other wall. The other wings touched each other in the middle of the house, and he overlaid the cherubim with gold. And so that's kind of what you get here in the innermost part, or the most holy place, is not just the Ark of the Covenant. There are also 2 really large cherubim whose wings basically covered sort of the entire length, or sort of almost the entire width of the most holy place. That's a detail that I typically forget about when I think about the construction of the temple. So we see verse 29, that around all the walls of the house he carved engraved figures of cherubim and palm trees and open flowers in the inner rooms. The floor of the house he made with gold in the inner and outer rooms. Now, one thing I didn't mention was the fact that there were also gourds covered in, right? Verse 18, that was part of the engraving, at least within the inner sanctuary. And for me, I don't know what a gourd is. I know some of y'all probably do. I don't know what a gourd is. Do people eat gourds? Do y'all eat gourds?
No.
Okay, all right. So I don't know what they are. I know, we read about in Jonah, right there at the very end of Jonah, the story of Jonah. There's a gourd that's prepared by God. Anyway, that's what a gourd looks like. I don't know what gourds are, so I had to look up what that was. I know what a palm tree. I know what flowers look like. I have to look up what a cherubim looks like, but gourds, I didn't know what they looked like, but that's what they look like. That was part of the encarving within the temple, something we don't often think about. There's another picture there of the temple as well, but if we notice verse 30, again, the floor of the house he overlaid with gold in the inner and outer rooms. For the entrance to the inner sanctuary he made doors of olive wood. The lintel and the doorposts were 5-sided. He covered the 2 doors of olive wood with carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. He overlaid them with gold and spread gold on the cherubim and on the palm trees. Now, we might remember that the palm tree is connected to royalty. We think about palm trees in a nice way today because we think about Florida. And I know most people think about Florida this time of the year. They think about it in a positive way because it's warmer. Although this week it'll feel like Florida by Thursday because of how warm it will get. But at this time point, we know that palm trees sometimes were also connected to royalty. Obviously, when Jesus was riding into Jerusalem, the people worshipped him, but in part by waving what as he rode in? Palm leaves, right? It was a sign of welcoming royalty. When you think about God, who we know to be the King of Kings, it was also another reason why palm trees specifically are mentioned here, because they were connected to royalty, and obviously God being the king of the ultimate king of the people of Israel, Solomon recognized that. This is another thing that I thought about too when it came to connection from the concept of the temple to today. If you go especially to Europe and you see some of the larger cathedrals, for instance, you think about the Sistine Chapel in Italy, where Michelangelo painted the roof, which this is part of the Sistine Chapel. You notice that a lot of their cathedrals have artwork on it. Some churches, maybe even in the United States, have those window panes that have maybe biblical figures on them. Well, that concept of decoration or artwork being applied to a worship building kind of traces back to the temple. And I'm not exactly sure, but I think perhaps maybe that over the past few centuries, at least since over the past 2,000 years or 1,500 years or so, that perhaps Catholicism picked up on some of that, at least borrowed that idea of why cathedrals are decorated in that way. They thought about the decorations that Solomon made in the temple. That's sort of an interesting parallel to me that perhaps traces its roots back to the decorations that Solomon approved of, the carvings that were approved of within the temple. So that's an interesting idea, or that's a potential idea. Verse 33, so also he made for the entrance to the nave or to the holy place, again, doorpost of olive wood in the form of a square, and 2 doors of cypress wood. The 2 leaves of the one door were folding, and the 2 leaves of the other door were folding. On them he carved cherubim and palm trees and open flowers, and he overlaid them with gold evenly applied on the carved work. He built the inner court with 3 courses of cut stone and 1 course of cedar beams. Now, one thing that we know about the temple, especially by the time you get to the New Testament, this was true. But when you think about the temple as it was built, it's not just the holy place and it's not just the most holy place, because that's where the priests would reside. But obviously, when people brought their sacrifices, they have to bring their sacrifices to somewhere, and they're not just going to go right into the holy place to bring, all kinds of animals. And so around the temple, you had what was called the court of the Jews, which is where if you're an Israelite, right, you could bring your sacrifices. And obviously your sacrifice, you have the altar of burnt offering, which is depicted right here on the right. You also had several basins that were also there to basically allow people to clean themselves before the sacrifices were made. Because again, that goes back to the Old Testament laws. But within, at least around the temple itself, you had a period where if you're not a priest, you could enter into that place. And that's where you would bring your animal sacrifice. And that's where the priest would take it and go through the whole sacrifice process. You might notice that outside the temple or the court of the Jews, you had a separate court. And this was particularly true in times of in the New Testament. You had a separate court that was outside of that court, and who would that court be reserved for? Gentiles. So there are two separate courts that surrounded the temple. If you are a Gentile, if you're not a native-born Israelite, you could not enter into this court. Instead, you had to remain on what was called the outer court or the court of the Gentiles. So, in the New Testament time, typically Roman soldiers were... Sorry, go back. There we go. Roman soldiers were typically stationed in the outer court. They weren't supposed to go into the inner court, which was only reserved for the Jews. So that's maybe one characteristic about it. If you're reading in the New Testament, you read about Roman soldiers in the temple, especially towards the end of Jesus' life. That may be a detail that you don't pick up on, that there are two different courts, and the outer court was the only part of the temple compound, we might say, where Gentiles were actually allowed to go to. But that's sort of a depiction of what that looked like. And that also kind of helps explain, too, that the house that's being talked about being built here, there's also an outer compound around it for the purpose of offering sacrifices. So it says, verse 37, that in the 4th year, the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid in the month of Ziv, and in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished in all its parts, and according to all its specifications, he was 7 years in building it. And so, while it takes 7 years to build this part of the temple, and that's obviously to get all the overlay and things like that done. It takes a long time, but obviously its purpose would be very important. It would represent the dwelling place of God, especially when the ark is brought into the temple when we get to 1 Kings chapter 8. With that being said, are there any comments or any additional thoughts or questions that we might have about the structure of the temple? I know there's not a whole lot of application here. We've kind of already gone through that. But these are some visual details perhaps that give you a better idea of maybe what the temple looked like. At least in my mind, it helps me when I read through 1 Kings chapter 6, all those details to try to put a picture to it.
All this was done by hand. That boggles my mind, all that carving.
Yeah.
Just tremendous skill those guys had to have to do all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Doing all that by hand. Perhaps the carving being the most difficult of the work. And of course, there are some details there that are there in this temple that are not going to be there when the temple is rebuilt. Obviously, this temple was a lot nicer, at least on the inside. That temple was a lot nicer. If you were a priest and you look at the second temple that's built, it's not going to look nearly as nice as it did during Solomon's time, which is why we understand in the book of Ezra why the older people who could remember this wept when they saw the construction of the new temple. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and stop here. Next week we'll pick up in chapter 7 and we'll talk about the Solomon building himself a house in 1 Kings chapter 7. So again, thank you for your time and thank you for your attention this morning.